The winter of 1888 came down on the High Valley like a hammer. It was a place that did not suffer fools or weak construction. The wind that scoured its rocky shoulders was born in the frozen north and arrived without apology, a thief that stole heat from every log and every living body. The settlers who had chosen this place were hardy and proud, people who believed that survival was a matter of will, of swinging an axe with enough force and feeding a fire with enough wood. They built their cabins the way their fathers had, with thick logs and mud chinking, and they faced the cold with a stubborn defiance that was both their greatest strength and their most profound weakness. The cold did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the walls, a silent, invisible tide. It laid a film of ice on the water buckets just feet from the hearth. It crept across the floorboards and wrapped its fingers around the ankles of sleeping children. The sound of the valley in winter was the groan of timber contracting in the frost, the ceaseless howl of the wind, and the sharp crack of an axe biting into frozen wood. It was a constant battle, fought from the first frost of October to the last thaw of May, and the currency of this war was firewood. A man's wealth was measured not in acres or coin, but in the height and breadth of his woodpile. This universal struggle was the great equalizer. Even Silas, the valley's most respected builder, felt the icy siege. His cabin was the tightest, his hearth the largest, his woodpile a fortress of split oak and pine. Yet inside, his wife and children lived in a small orbit of warmth, wrapped in wool and fur. Their world shrunk to the few feet of floor space, illuminated by the fire's hungry glow. Beyond that small circle, the cabin was a cave of cold. Frost painted delicate, cruel ferns on the inside of the window panes and crept like a pale moss up the log walls. They burned through a cord of wood in 2 weeks, then another, and another. It was simply the way of things, a hardship to be endured, a testament to their resilience. No one questioned it. No one imagined a different way. Into this world of accepted struggle lived Ilara. She was a widow, a fact the valley treated as a mark of fragility. Her husband, Arthur, had been a man from the city, an engineer with soft hands and a mind full of strange diagrams and theories. He spoke of thermodynamics and convection, of thermal mass and insulation, words that meant nothing to men who understood the simple, honest language of the broadaxe and the wedge. They had called him a dreamer, a man whose head was too full of books to be of any use in a place that demanded calluses. He had died of a fever the previous spring, leaving Ilara with their young son, Thomas, and a stack of carefully drawn schematics for a house he had never had the chance to build. Ilara was seen as an extension of her husband's strangeness. She was quiet, observant, and spent more time reading his old textbooks than she did gossiping at the settlement's single store. The community watched her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They knew her woodpile was small, a pathetic mound compared to the bulwarks of her neighbors. They knew her son was frail, prone to a winter cough that raveled in his small chest. They expected her to fail, to pack up and return to whatever softer world she had come from, or worse. They expected the winter to claim her. But Ilara had a plan. One morning in late summer, as the first hint of autumn's chill sharpened the air, she unrolled Arthur's old drawings on her small kitchen table. The paper was worn and soft, covered in his precise, elegant script and detailed cross-sections of walls and foundations. It was not a plan for a cabin. It was a plan for a machine for living, a machine designed to capture and hold heat. The idea was radical in its simplicity. It did not seek to fight the cold with a bigger fire. It sought to make the cold irrelevant by refusing it entry. It was a house designed to breathe, to hold warmth in its very bones. The core of the design was a double wall, an outer wall of thick, sturdy logs to break the wind, and then a gap of nearly a foot, and then an inner wall. This gap, Arthur's notes explained, was to be filled with sawdust, straw, and packed earth, materials the others saw as refuse. This would form a blanket of insulation, a barrier of trapped, still air that heat could not easily cross. The foundation was to be dug deep, below the frost line, and made of heavy stone to anchor the house to the earth's stable temperature. And at the heart of it all was the true innovation, a central masonry heater, a great mass of brick and clay with a long, serpentine flue that would snake through an interior wall. The fire would burn hot and fast, and the smoke would travel a long, slow path, surrendering all its heat to the masonry before exiting the chimney. The house itself would become a gentle, radiant stove. Her first step was to acquire the stone for the foundation. She knew she could not quarry it herself, so she walked to the home of Silas, the master builder. She found him splitting logs, the axe moving with an easy, powerful rhythm. He stopped, leaning on the handle, and wiped a forearm across his brow as she approached. He was a large man, confident in his skill and his place in the valley. He listened with a patient, almost fatherly air as she explained her need for cut stone. But when she began to describe the reason, the deep foundation, the double walls, the masonry heater, his patience curdled into disbelief, then outright amusement. "A wall inside a wall?" he grunted, a laugh rumbling in his chest. "Woman, that's a waste of good timber and a fool's amount of work. The cold comes from the north, not from the ground." He shook his head, looking at her as if she were a child describing a fantasy. "And this smoke snake of yours, you'll fill your house with fumes and choke yourselves before the first snow. A straight flue draws best. Everyone knows that." A few other men, working nearby, had stopped to listen. A chuckle went through them. The idea was absurd. It violated every principle of construction they held dear. They built for strength against wind and snow, not for this invisible thing she called thermal mass. One of them called out, "You'll be building all winter, Ilara. And for what? A house full of sawdust and smoke." The laughter that followed was not cruel, not exactly. It was the confident, dismissive laughter of practical men who knew the world as it was, and who saw before them a woman chasing a ghost. Silas clapped her on the shoulder, his expression softening to one of pity. "Stick to what you know, Ilara. Build a proper cabin. I'll even help you raise the logs. But this is folly." The name stuck. As Ilara began her work, the project became known throughout the valley as Ilara's Folly. She paid 2 young men a fair price to quarry and haul the stone, but they did so with winks and knowing smiles, taking the widow's money for a fool's errand. After that, she worked alone. She rose before the sun, and with a shovel and pickaxe, she began to dig. The community had never seen a foundation like it. Their cabins sat on shallow stone footings, just enough to lift the first logs off the damp ground. Ilara dug down 5 feet, striking rock and roots, her hands blistering and then hardening into leather. The hole grew slowly, a testament to a quiet, unyielding determination that baffled her neighbors. They would pass by on their way to the woods or the fields and see her there, a small figure in a giant hole, and they would shake their heads. The physical labor was a relentless torment and a strange solace. Each shovelful of earth was an act of faith. Each stone she wrestled into place in the foundation trench was a brick in her fortress against the coming cold. She learned the heft and balance of tools her husband had only ever drawn. She learned to mix mortar to the right consistency, feeling the grit and water with her own hands. She worked with a methodical patience that was alien to the valley's ethos of quick, practical construction. She did not rush. She measured every stone, checked every level, following Arthur's plans with a devotion that was both scientific and sacred. It was the last thing he had given her, and she would honor it. While she toiled through the waning days of summer and the crisp, golden light of autumn, the rest of the valley prepared for winter in the time-honored way. Silas and his crew raised a new cabin for a family that had arrived in the spring. They worked with impressive speed, the logs notched and fitted in a matter of days. The sound of their hammers and saws was a confident, communal rhythm, a stark contrast to the solitary scrape of Ilara's trowel and the soft thud of her rubber mallet. They chinked the gaps with mud and dried moss, a technique that worked well enough for a time. They finished the cabin in 3 weeks, celebrating with a barn-raising supper, and immediately began adding to their woodpiles, the real work of winter survival. Their world was one of visible, tangible preparations. They saw Ilara's slow, strange progress as a tragic waste of the season's precious final days of warmth. She was building a fortress, they joked, but she was building it too slowly. The winter would arrive before the roof was on. They saw her hauling buckets of sawdust from the small, abandoned lumber mill, a material they considered little more than flammable trash, and they shook their heads in pity. She was alone, isolated not by distance, but by an idea they could not comprehend. Her diligence was, in their eyes, the stubborn persistence of a madwoman. As the outer walls of logs went up, the structure began to look something like a normal cabin, and for a moment the valley thought she might have abandoned her foolish plan. But then she began to build the inner wall, a lighter frame of wood that left a cavernous, perplexing gap between the two. This was the moment that sealed their judgment. It made no sense. It was structurally redundant, a waste of precious lumber. When they saw her begin to fill that gap, bucket by painstaking bucket, with a mixture of sawdust and dry dirt, the mockery returned, sharper this time. "She's building a dirt house," one man said at the general store, to a round of laughter. "The first big rain will turn her walls to mud." Ilara heard the whispers. She felt their eyes on her as she worked. But their skepticism was like the wind. She could feel it, but it could not move her. She was focused on the details. The inner wall was not just a container for insulation. It was also the scaffold for the heart of the home. She began to build the masonry heater, a task that required a mason's skill she did not possess, but learned from Arthur's books. She laid each fire brick with care, building the firebox, the secondary combustion chamber, and the complex, winding path the hot gases would have to travel. This was the engine of the house. It was a slow, intricate process. The flue snaked back and forth inside a thick interior wall that divided the main living space from the small bedroom. That wall, a monolith of brick and clay, was designed to become a massive, gentle radiator, warming the entire house for hours after the fire itself had died down. She installed the windows herself. They were small, another point of ridicule for a community that valued the light of the long summer days. But Arthur's notes were clear. Windows were holes through which heat escaped. Hers were small, and more importantly, they were double-paned. She had used the last of her savings to have 2 panes of glass shipped from the city for each window, creating a small air gap between them, another layer of invisible insulation. The roof was last. She angled it steeply, not just to shed the heavy snows she knew were coming, but to catch the low, weak rays of the winter sun, turning the dark shingles into a passive solar collector. Every element of the design worked in concert, a symphony of thermodynamics that her neighbors could not hear. When she finally lit the first fire in the completed heater, the draw was perfect. There was no smoke. The fire roared to life, burned intensely for 2 hours, and then she shut the flue. A deep, resonant warmth began to emanate from the central brick wall, a warmth that felt alive. It was not the scorching, temporary heat of an open fire, but a steady, persistent presence. It worked. The first snows came in November, a light dusting that served as a polite warning. Then the cold settled in, and the valley began its long war. By mid-December, the winter had shown its teeth. The wind was a constant, keening presence, and temperatures at night dropped so low that the trees themselves seemed to groan in protest. The families in their traditional cabins drew inward, their lives constricting around the hungry mouths of their iron stoves. The sound of splitting wood was constant. But then, in the first week of January, the hammer fell. The sky turned a bruised, slate gray, and the air grew unnaturally still and heavy. The old-timers felt it in their bones. A great storm was coming. It arrived not with a roar, but with a whisper of fine, hard ice crystals driven on a rising wind. Within hours, that whisper became a scream. It was a blizzard of a scale and fury none of them had ever witnessed. They called it a white hurricane. The wind did not just blow. It struck the cabins like a physical blow, rattling the windows and finding every tiny crack in the chinking. The snow was not soft and fluffy. It was a horizontal torrent of granular ice that sandblasted the walls and buried everything in its path. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. For 3 days, the storm raged without pause. The temperature plummeted to 30, then 40 degrees below zero. It was a cold that was actively hostile, a cold that felt like a living entity trying to force its way inside. In the cabins scattered across the valley, the battle for survival became desperate. The traditional log homes, which had seemed so sturdy and warm in the summer sun, became brittle shells against the Arctic onslaught. The wind drove the fine, icy snow through the smallest gaps in the walls, dusting the floors and furniture with a layer of white. The mud and moss chinking, frozen solid, contracted and cracked, falling away in chunks, opening up new avenues for the cold to invade. The iron stoves, which had once been the warm hearts of their homes, became ravenous beasts. Men were forced to venture out into the blinding storm to their woodpiles, fighting their way back with armloads of wood that seemed to vanish into the firebox with little effect. The heat that radiated from the stove was stolen almost immediately, sucked away by the drafts and the super-chilled logs of the walls. Frost climbed a foot, then 2 feet up the interior walls, a beautiful and terrifying crystalline growth. Families huddled together under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air of their own homes. The cabins were failing. The old way was failing. Inside Silas's cabin, the situation was dire. As the valley's best builder, he had the best home, but the storm made a mockery of his craftsmanship. A furious fire roared in his large stone hearth, devouring logs at an alarming rate, yet the heat barely reached the far corners of the room. His wife was constantly melting snow for water, as the water bucket, even by the fire, had frozen solid. His youngest son, a boy of 5, had developed a deep, rattling cough, and his feverish skin was a stark contrast to the bitter cold of the room. Silas felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. He was losing the fight. His pride, his skill, his strength, none of it mattered. The storm was too big, the cold too absolute. Meanwhile, in Ilara's folly, the world was quiet. The scream of the wind outside was muted to a distant, mournful hum, the sound filtered and tamed by the thick, insulated walls. The house stood firm, its deep stone foundation unmoving against the gale. There were no drafts. The double-paned windows were clear of frost, offering a blurry view of the white chaos outside. At the center of the small home, the masonry heater was a silent, warm heart. Ilara had fired it that morning, a small, hot fire of just a few logs that had burned out in under 2 hours. Now, hours later, the massive brick wall that snaked through the house radiated a steady, even warmth. It was not a blistering heat, but a comfortable, ambient temperature that filled every corner of the home. She and Thomas sat at the table, reading. The boy was in his shirt sleeves, his cheeks rosy with warmth, not fever. His cough was gone. There was no desperate, constant feeding of the fire. There was no huddling under blankets. The house itself was doing the work, holding the precious heat from that one small fire and refusing to surrender it to the storm. The machine was working perfectly. She had used 6 logs all day. The contrast was absolute. Outside, a world of lethal, screaming cold. Inside, a small pocket of calm, resilient warmth. She looked at her son, safe and comfortable, and felt a profound sense of peace. Arthur had been right. The temperature inside her home was a stable 65 degrees. In Silas's cabin, less than a mile away, it was barely 35 degrees, and that was only in the small bubble of space next to a fire that was consuming his winter wood supply at a catastrophic rate. He had burned through a week's worth of wood in a single day. He looked at his son, whose breathing was growing shallower, and knew he had to do something. A horrifying thought crept into his mind. The widow, Elara. He had mocked her, laughed at her foolishness. But her house was new. Perhaps it was tighter. More than that, a desperate, irrational thought surfaced. Perhaps her folly had somehow worked. He had to know. Fear for his child finally overcame his pride. Bundling himself in every layer of wool and fur he owned, Silas stepped out into the blizzard. The wind tore at him, a physical force that stole his breath and tried to knock him from his feet. The snow was waist-deep, and he fought for every step, navigating by memory through a world that had no landmarks, only a blinding, shifting wall of white. It was a journey of a few hundred yards, but it felt like miles. He arrived at her small house, a dark shape barely visible in the maelstrom, and was shocked to see no plume of smoke rising from the chimney. His heart sank. He was too late. The fire was out. They had frozen. He pounded on the solid wood door, his gloved fist making a dull thud against the wood. He shouted her name, his voice snatched away by the wind. He waited, his hope draining away, and was about to turn back when the door opened. A rectangle of soft, yellow light fell upon the snow, and with it, a wave of warmth washed over him. It was not the dry, scorching heat of a stove, but a gentle, humid warmth that felt impossibly luxurious. Elara stood there, holding a lamp. She was not bundled in furs. She wore a simple wool dress. Behind her, he could see the boy, Thomas, playing on the wooden floor with a set of carved blocks. Silas was speechless. He stared past her into the calm, warm interior. He saw no roaring fire. He saw no frost on the walls. He saw a home that seemed to be in a different season, an island of temperate calm in the midst of the Arctic hurricane. The sheer impossibility of it struck him dumb. He had come expecting to find a tragedy, a grim confirmation of his own superior wisdom. Instead, he had found a miracle. His mind struggled to reconcile what his senses were telling him. The warmth was real. The quiet was real. He had been wrong, utterly, completely, and dangerously wrong. Elara did not smile in triumph. She did not say, "I told you so." Her expression was one of calm concern. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the ice caked in his beard, the exhaustion in his posture. "Come in out of the cold, Silas," she said, her voice even. He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the storm, and the scream of the wind was instantly cut off, replaced by a profound and welcome silence. He unwrapped the scarf from his face and stood there, dripping melted snow onto the floor, looking around like a man in a dream. He walked hesitantly toward the central brick wall and placed a bare hand against it. It was warm to the touch, a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to radiate from within the very substance of the brick. "Where is the fire?" he asked, his voice raspy. "It's out," Ilara said simply. "I last fired it this morning. The heat is in the wall." She gestured to the massive structure. "The fire warms the stone, and the stone warms the house. It holds the heat for a long time." She offered him a steaming mug of broth. He took it, his hands trembling slightly as they wrapped around the warm ceramic. He had spent his life building houses to keep the weather out. This woman had built a house that held the warmth in. The concept was so simple, yet so revolutionary, that it shattered his entire understanding of his craft. His pride was a heap of ashes at his feet. He thought of his own home, a frigid cave where his child was shivering with fever. He looked at Thomas, healthy and warm, and the full weight of his foolishness crashed down upon him. He met Ilara's eyes, and in them he saw not judgment, but a quiet competence and a deep, weary strength. "My son," he said, the words catching in his throat. "He is sick. The cold. Our cabin is like ice." Ilara nodded slowly. "Bring him here," she said. "Bring your family. There is room." Silas fought his way back through the storm, a man transformed. He returned not just with his sick child, but with his entire family. As his wife and children stepped out of the biting wind and into the steady, even warmth of Ilara's home, their faces registered the same shock and disbelief he had felt. His wife began to weep, tears of relief freezing on her cheeks before she was fully inside. They settled his feverish son near the warm brick wall, and within an hour, the boy's shivering subsided, his breathing easing into a peaceful sleep. News, even in a blizzard, has a way of traveling. Silas, knowing the desperation of his neighbors, sent his oldest son to the nearest cabin, and from there the word spread like a slow, desperate fire. A family struggling to keep their fire alive saw a lantern approaching, a figure fighting through the snow. They learned of the widow's ark. One by one, then in small, huddled groups, the families of the valley made the perilous journey to Ilara's folly. Each time the door opened, the story repeated itself. The blast of Arctic air, the shocked faces, the disbelief giving way to awe as they stepped into the impossible warmth. Ilara's small two-room house became a refuge. It was crowded, filled with the hushed, grateful voices of people who had been on the verge of freezing. They looked at the warm brick, at the calm, quiet widow, and at their own children, now safe, and they understood. The laughter and mockery of the autumn seemed like a distant memory from a foolish, arrogant time. When the great storm finally broke after 4 long days, the valley was transformed. The sun shone on a world buried in a sea of white. The landscape was pristine and beautiful, but the silence was heavy with the memory of the ordeal. As the families returned to their own ice-filled cabins, they saw their homes with new eyes. They saw the cracks, the drafts, the thinness of the walls. They saw them not as shelters, but as failures. The ordeal had broken more than just their chinking. It had broken their certainty. A few days later, Silas returned to Ilara's house. He did not come to offer thanks, though his gratitude was immense. He came with a clean plank of pine wood and a piece of charcoal, his face etched with a humility that no one in the valley had ever seen on him before. He stood before Ilara, the master builder before the novice who had outbuilt him with books and sawdust. He held out the plank and the charcoal. "Teach me," he said. The two words were a surrender, a plea, and a promise. They marked the end of the old way. Ilara did not hesitate. She retrieved Arthur's worn schematics and spread them out on the table where it had all begun. The other men of the valley, hearing what Silas had done, began to gather. They crowded into her warm home, their hats in their hands, their faces serious and attentive. They were no longer skeptics. They were students. She explained everything she had learned from Arthur's notes and from her own labor. She spoke of the deep foundation connecting the house to the thermal stability of the earth. She explained how the double wall and the insulation created a barrier of still air, the most effective defense against conductive heat loss. She traced the path of the serpentine flue with her finger, explaining how it forced the smoke to give up almost all of its heat energy to the brick mass before it was allowed to escape. "You are used to seeing the value of a fire in its flames," she told them, "but most of the heat is in the smoke. Your straight chimneys send all that value right out into the sky. This house keeps it." She answered their questions patiently, explaining the principles of convection, radiation, and thermal mass in simple, practical terms. She held nothing back. The knowledge was not hers to hoard. It was a legacy from her husband, and its purpose was to keep people safe. She was not a builder, but she was a teacher, and they were a captive audience. That spring, a new sound echoed through the valley. It was the sound of pickaxes striking the earth, digging deep. No one was patching their old cabins. They were starting over. Under Ilara's quiet guidance and Silas's newfound, humble expertise, they began to build new homes, valley houses, as they came to be called. The landscape of the settlement physically changed. The new houses sat lower, anchored more firmly to the ground. They were built with the same meticulous care Ilara had demonstrated, the double walls rising, the gaps filled with sawdust and straw. Silas, once the valley's foremost expert on traditional log construction, was now its most passionate advocate for insulation and masonry heaters. He taught the other men how to lay fire brick, how to calculate the length of a flue, how to build a house that worked with nature instead of just fighting it. The following winter was just as cold, but the valley was a different place. There was no desperate, constant ring of the axe. The woodpiles lasted longer. The homes were not just shelters, they were sanctuaries of steady, reliable warmth. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. The story of their survival, and of the widow's strange house, began to travel. A government surveyor, charting the territory, heard the tale in a nearby town. Intrigued by the reports of a settlement that had weathered the White Hurricane with impossible ease, he made a special trip into the High Valley. He spent a week there, measuring the houses, sketching their design, and interviewing Silas and the other builders. He spent a long afternoon with Ilara, who showed him Arthur's original plans. The surveyor, a man with an engineering background himself, recognized the genius in the design immediately. He documented it all in his official report, including detailed drawings of the double-wall construction and the central masonry heater. He called it the Valley House Principle, a model for sustainable, resilient construction in harsh northern climates. The idea, born in a city dreamer's mind and forged by a widow's desperate determination, began its quiet journey out into the wider world, carried in a dry government report and in the stories of travelers who passed through a valley known for its impossibly warm homes. Years passed. Ilara watched her son grow into a strong young man in the warmth of the house she had built for him. She never remarried, but she was never alone. She became the quiet, respected heart of the community, a source of wisdom and calm. The valley thrived, its people safe and prosperous, their lives no longer defined by a brutal annual war against the cold. They had learned a profound lesson, one that had been built into the very foundations of their new homes. They learned that the most formidable enemy is not the howling blizzard or the biting frost, but the stubborn pride that refuses to see a better way. The greatest strength was not in the arm that could split the most wood, but in the humility to learn from an unexpected source, and the wisdom to understand that true survival is not about fighting the storm, but about building a shelter so well that the storm no longer matters.